My husband asked me to sit down after dinner one evening and told me he had something important to say. He was not sick. He was not dying. He was not in any trouble that I could see. He was simply sitting across from me at our dining room table, the same table where we had shared thousands of meals across 30 years of marriage, and he was holding his coffee cup with both hands the way he always does when something is weighing on him. And he said very carefully, "Barbara, I need to tell you something that I should have told you a long time ago. I've been working up the courage for months. I think I'm finally ready. I am 66 years old. My name is Barbara. My husband's name is Robert. We have been married for 30 years, raised 2 children together, buried both of his parents and my mother, survived a cancer scare in his early 50s that turned out to be benign, and built a life together that, from the outside, anyone who knew us would describe as solid, grounded, and genuinely happy. I believed them. I believed us. I want to tell you that I sat calmly across from my husband that evening and simply listened, fully prepared for whatever he was about to share. But the truth is that the moment he said those words, something I should have told you a long time ago, something in my chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt since his cancer scare 14 years earlier. A particular cold, presentient dread that the body understands before the mind has had time to process exactly what it is afraid of. What Robert told me over the next 2 hours was not what I expected. It was not an affair. It was not a financial crisis. It was not the kind of thing most people imagine when they hear the phrase, "After 30 years, he finally told me the truth." It was something I had never once, in 30 years of marriage, thought to wonder about. And in some ways, because it was so completely outside anything I had imagined, it was more disorienting than any of the things I had briefly, instinctively feared in the moment before he began speaking. I want to tell you the whole story. Not because it ended in disaster, and not because it ended in some perfect, tidy resolution either. But because I think what happened between Robert and me, and what has happened in the months since that dinner, contains something true and important about what it really means to know another person. Even after 30 years of building a life together at very close range to understand what Robert's confession meant, and why it landed the way it did, you need to understand the particular kind of people we each are, and the kind of marriage we had built across 3 decades. Robert and I met in 1994, at a church retreat in upstate New York, both of us 36 years old, both of us previously married and carrying, respectively, the quiet damage that first marriages sometimes leave behind. Robert's first marriage, to a woman named Diane, had lasted 7 years before ending in what he described, in our early years of knowing each other, as a mutual, relatively amicable dissolution. 2 people who had genuinely loved each other but had discovered slowly and painfully that they wanted fundamentally different things from their lives. My own first marriage, to a man named Gary, had been shorter and considerably less amicable, ending after 3 years in circumstances that left me, for several years afterward, with a particular wariness toward men who seemed to be withholding something. Men who smiled too smoothly, answered questions just a little too easily, gave you what you wanted to hear rather than what was actually true. Robert was nothing like that. From our first real conversation at that retreat, he struck me as a man constitutionally incapable of smooth performance. He stumbled over his words when he was nervous. He contradicted himself, and then corrected himself immediately. He told me things that were mildly embarrassing to admit. Small failures, private uncertainties, the kind of ordinary human imperfection that most people carefully edit out of first impressions. I found this quality in him immediately, deeply reassuring in a way I had not expected to find anything about another man reassuring at that particular point in my life. We married in 1996, 2 years after meeting, in a simple ceremony at a small inn in Vermont, just family and close friends. Robert worked as a civil engineer for the county government, steady, unglamorous work that suited his practical, methodical personality exactly. I worked as a high school guidance counselor for over 20 years, work that I found enormously meaningful, helping teenagers navigate some of the most difficult passages of their young lives. We had 2 children together fairly quickly. Our son Thomas was born in 1997, and our daughter Anna in 1999. We also each brought some history from our earlier lives. I had a daughter from my first marriage, Ellie, who was 11 when Robert and I wed, and who Robert treated with a quiet, consistent warmth across her teenage years that I still consider among the most genuinely admirable things I ever watched him do. Our marriage was, I want to say honestly, genuinely happy in most of the ways that matter. We argued sometimes. About money, about how to handle various parenting situations, about the ordinary differences in temperament and priority that any two people living closely together accumulate across decades. But underneath the ordinary friction, I always understood our marriage to be built on a foundation of real mutual knowing. Robert knew me, my fears, my patterns, my history, my private vulnerabilities, and I believed completely that I knew him in the same way. Robert was not a man who kept things to himself. That was not his nature. He processed things out loud with me, the way we had done almost from the very beginning of our relationship. He was not a man who brooded over private concerns for months without sharing them. He brought things to me, work frustrations, old memories that surfaced unexpectedly, worries about our children, questions about his own direction and purpose. Openness was, I believed, simply how Robert was built. This is why, when he sat down across from me after dinner that evening with something he had apparently been working up the courage to share for months, my first response was not simply concern about whatever the specific thing might be. It was a kind of disbelief that something significant could have been sitting inside him, unshared for months, without my having felt even the faintest signal of it across all our ordinary daily closeness. That disbelief, I believe, was the first real indication of how much his confession was about to unsettle that I noticed the change in Robert about 4 months before he finally sat me down. Looking back now, I can trace it with reasonable accuracy to a particular October afternoon when he came home from what had been a routine visit to his doctor for an annual physical, and he was quieter than usual through dinner, and when I asked him whether everything was fine at the appointment, he said yes, everything was perfectly fine, and something in how he said it, just slightly too quickly, just slightly too flatly, made me look at him a moment longer than I might otherwise have. I asked him twice more over the following days whether something was troubling him. He told me each time that he was fine, perhaps just a little tired, perhaps thinking through something work-related that would resolve itself without my needing to be involved. I told myself I was imagining things. After 30 years of marriage, I was perhaps simply reading too much into ordinary variations in his mood, projecting concern where none was warranted, the particular anxious attentiveness that my own history with an unreliable first marriage had perhaps permanently installed in me, turning me sometimes into a woman who looked for hidden things where no hidden things actually existed. But the quietness did not resolve the way a passing mood resolves. It deepened subtly across the following months. Not dramatically, Robert continued functioning normally in every practical respect, going to work, engaging warmly with our children and grandchildren when they visited, maintaining the ordinary daily rhythms of our shared life without any visible disruption. But there was an interior quality to him across those months, a particular inwardness, that I had genuinely never noticed in him before across our entire marriage, and which I found, no matter how many times I talked myself out of my concern, impossible to fully dismiss. I want to describe one specific evening during this period, because I believe it captures the particular quality of those months better than any general description could. We were sitting together in our living room on a Friday evening, me reading, Robert watching a baseball game with the volume low, a comfortable and familiar Friday pattern we had maintained for many years. At some point, I looked up from my book and I noticed Robert was not actually watching the game. He was looking at it without seeing it, the expression on his face one of such complete private absorption that the game might as well not have been playing at all. I said his name softly. He looked up immediately, and something in his expression shifted. That particular micro-adjustment people make when they realize they have been caught somewhere else entirely. He said, "Sorry. Just thinking." I asked him what about. He looked at me for a moment in a way I could not quite read. Something between the impulse to say something specific and the decision, one more time, not to say it yet. Then he said, "Nothing important. Just old things that I let it go." I went back to my book. But that phrase stayed with me afterward. Old things. Whatever Robert was carrying, I understood from that moment, it did not belong to the present. It belonged to some part of his life I either had not known about or had not known about fully. And The knowledge that he had something from his own history sitting large enough and heavy enough inside him to pull him out of an ordinary Friday evening, something he had been sitting with privately for months without sharing, produced in me a particular low, persistent ache that I carried through the remaining weeks until the evening he finally told me. He arranged the dinner deliberately, I realize now. He cooked himself. Which Robert does sometimes, though not regularly, and when he does, it tends to signal something intentional. A meal built around a purpose rather than simply around hunger. He opened a bottle of wine that we had been saving for a specific occasion, though he did not say what occasion this was. And after we had eaten and the dishes were cleared, when most evenings we would have moved to the living room, he asked me to stay at the table. He said, "Barbara, I need to tell you something that I should have told you a long time ago." I put my hands flat on the table. I looked at him, and I waited. He began by telling me that he had never told me the full truth about why his first marriage ended. I had believed across 30 years what he had told me during our early relationship, that it had been a mutual dissolution, two people who loved each other but wanted different things from their lives. This, he told me now, was the simplified version of a considerably more complicated truth. He told me that during the final 2 years of his marriage to Diane, he had been struggling with something about himself that he had not understood clearly enough, at the time, to name or to address honestly, and that had driven, in ways he had not been able to fully admit even to himself until considerably later, the ultimate dissolution of that marriage. He told me that what he had been struggling with, in those final years of his first marriage, and in the years immediately following its end, was his own understanding of his sexual identity. He told me that in the period after his first marriage ended, before he and I had met, he had come to understand that he was bisexual, and that his attraction to men, something he had suppressed and denied for most of his adult life, had been one of the unaddressed underlying tensions in his first marriage, a tension neither he nor Diane had understood clearly enough to name or address honestly before the marriage collapsed around it. I sat very still as Robert said these words. I want to describe carefully and honestly the full scope of what Robert told me across those 2 hours at our dinner table, because understanding the complete picture matters to understanding how I eventually came to process everything he shared. He told me that in the years between his first marriage ending and our meeting, he had allowed himself, for the first time in his adult life, to actually understand and accept this aspect of himself. He had not told anyone. Not his family, not his friends, not anyone in the particular mid-sized upstate New York world where we both lived, where in 1993 and 1994 such things carried considerably more social weight than they might carry in the same community today. He told me that when we met, and when he fell genuinely and completely in love with me, he made a decision he described as conscious and fully deliberate, not something he drifted into without awareness of what he was choosing. He decided that his love for me, and his desire to build a life with me, was what he wanted to commit to completely. He told me that he had not, across our 30 years of marriage, ever been unfaithful to me with anyone, man or woman. He told me our marriage had been, in every practical and emotional sense that mattered to him, exactly the real, complete, fully committed marriage it appeared to be from the outside. That he told me the reason he had never shared this aspect of himself with me was not any concern about how I would react. He said, and I believe him on this, that he had never doubted my capacity to hear this and respond to it with love and intelligence rather than panic or judgment. He had married a guidance counselor, he said, with a slight, careful attempt at a smile, and in 30 years he had never once seen me respond to human complexity with anything other than genuine thoughtfulness. He told me he had not told me because he had convinced himself, when we first married, that his pre-marriage understanding of his own sexuality was simply history, relevant only to a period of his life that had closed when our life together began. He had told himself that choosing me, and committing to me, effectively resolved the question rather than simply setting it aside, and that sharing information whose practical relevance had, in his view, already been settled by the choice he had made, would serve only to introduce unnecessary complexity and concern into a marriage he wanted to be clean and clear of anything that might seem like an unresolved shadow. He told me that the October doctor's appointment that I had noticed changing something in his mood was the appointment where his doctor, reviewing his overall health and history, had asked him some questions that touched, in a clinical and matter-of-fact way, on aspects of his history he had not thought about consciously in many years. He told me that the appointment itself had been completely routine, and that his health was entirely fine. But that the questions his doctor had asked had surfaced, unexpectedly, the awareness that he was carrying a significant piece of his own history completely hidden from the person he was closest to in the entire world. And that this awareness, once surfaced, had refused to be submerged again the way he had submerged it, apparently successfully, for so many years. He told me he had spent 4 months trying to decide how to tell me, not because he was uncertain about whether to tell me. He had become, over those 4 months, completely certain that he needed to, but because he had wanted to do it in a way that gave me as much context and care as he could offer, rather than simply blurting it out unprepared in some less deliberate moment, that he told me that he loved me. He said this not as a concluding reassurance, the kind people offer at the end of difficult conversations to soften whatever came before it, but as the central, organizing fact around which everything else he had told me was meant to be understood. He said, "Barbara, everything I have told you tonight is background to the 30 years we have actually lived together, not a contradiction of it. I am not telling you this because I want something to change. I am telling you this because I realized sitting across from you for 30 years, that you have never had the chance to love all of me, because I kept one piece of myself hid. Even from you. And I think you deserved better than that. I think we deserved better than that." I sat across from him for a long time without speaking. The candles had burned very low by this point. The coffee was cold. Outside, the October dark had settled fully around the house, and the room felt very quiet, very contained, just the two of us in 30 years and this thing he had finally given me. I thought about many things in that silence. I thought about the October evening I had noticed him looking through the baseball game without seeing it. I thought about what he had said that night. Old things. I thought about the guidance counselor in me, the part that had spent 20 years helping young people find language for exactly this kind of complexity. And I thought about the wife in me, who had spent 30 years believing she knew this man completely. Both of those women had something to say. I was not yet entirely sure which one should speak first that I asked him one question, before anything else. I said, "Are you happy, Robert? In this life we've built? In this marriage?" He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Something between relief and a kind of disbelief that this was actually the first question I had chosen to ask. He said, "Yes. Genuinely and completely. That is not something I am telling you to manage this conversation. It is simply true." I nodded. I picked up my cold coffee and held it, not drinking it, just holding it, the way he holds his when he is working through something. I told him I needed a little time before I said much else. He told me he understood completely, and that he would give me as much time as I needed, and that he was not going anywhere. I want to be honest about what the following weeks were like, because I think honesty matters more than a comfortable narrative here. I went through a period that I can only describe as a profound disorientation, not so much about the specific content of what Robert had told me, but about the experience of discovering that someone I had known at very close range for 30 years had been carrying something significant that I had not seen. The content itself, Robert's bisexuality, the aspect of his identity he had understood in his early 30s and then effectively filed away from our shared life, was something I processed with, I believe, genuine equanimity, at least relative to the disorientation about the concealment itself. I am a guidance counselor. I spent 20 years helping young people work through exactly this kind of identity complexity. I believe, and have always believed, that a person's sexual identity is their own, to understand and to share on their own terms and in their own time. The content of what Robert told me did not require me to revise my opinion of him or my love for him in any fundamental way. What required revision was something more subtle, and in some ways more disorienting. My understanding of the marriage itself. I had believed for 30 years that Robert and I had built our life on a foundation of near-complete mutual transparency. Learning that a piece of himself had been sitting outside that transparency, carefully maintained there across our entire marriage, required me to ask honestly whether I actually knew what our marriage had been built on, and whether the particular quality of trust one thought we shared was the quality I had believed it to be. I talked to my friend Carolyn, who who had known both Robert and me since before we married, who was one of the most grounded and honest people in my life, and whom I trusted to tell me what she actually thought rather than what she thought I wanted to hear. She listened to everything I shared with her, quietly and carefully, in the way Carolyn always listens. And then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "Barbara, I think there's a difference between keeping something hidden that affects your partner and keeping something hidden about yourself that you haven't yet found the courage to share." What Robert hid was not something he was doing. It was something he was. And while I understand completely why you feel unsettled about not knowing it, I think those are actually quite different kinds of withholding, and they probably deserve to be thought about differently. I sat with that distinction for a long time. I raised it with Robert about 3 weeks after his initial confession, in one of the conversations that began to unfold between us across the weeks that followed. A new kind of conversation, more careful and more deliberate than many of our ordinary exchanges, as we each tried to understand how to locate this new, fuller information inside the marriage we had actually lived. I told him I had been thinking about the difference between hiding something you are doing and hiding something you are, and that I wanted to understand, more completely, which one I was actually dealing with. He thought about this carefully before answering, in the way he always thinks about things he wants to answer honestly rather than quickly. He said, "I think it's both, Barbara, and I don't want to use one to excuse the other. It was something I was hiding about myself, yes. But I was also doing something with that hiding, across 30 years, which was making a decision about what you knew and didn't know about the person you were married to. And I don't think I get to claim the first framing and leave out the second." That answer, I believe, was one of the most genuinely honest things Robert had ever said to me across our entire marriage, precisely because it declined the easier, self-protective version of the answer in favor of the more complicated, more accurate one. I asked him, across those same weeks of conversation, what had made him finally decide that 4 months ago was the right time, after 30 years of a different choice. He said, "I think, honestly, what changed was that I turned 66 in the summer, and I started thinking about how much time we probably have left, and about what I wanted that time to look like. I had spent 30 years being known by you in a way that was real and complete in almost every way except one. And I realized that I didn't want to spend whatever time we have left with that one piece still sitting outside our marriage, invisible to you. I think I wanted to be fully known by you, finally, while we still had enough time left to actually build something around that fuller knowing." This answer undid something in me that I had been holding carefully closed since the evening of his confession, because it was not an answer about fear, or about external pressure, or about some crisis requiring management. It was an answer about love, about a 66-year-old man who loved his wife and wanted in the TI they had remaining, to finally let her see all of him rather than simply most of him. I cried when he said it. He came around the table and sat beside me and put his arm around me, the way he has done, across 30 years, in so many different moments requiring comfort. And I let him. The weeks that followed those initial difficult conversations were, I want to tell you honestly, among the most genuinely intimate of our entire marriage. Something had shifted in the particular quality of our closeness, something difficult to describe precisely but very real to live inside. The careful management of a significant omission, maintained across 30 years, creates, I now understand, a kind of background tension that is impossible to detect while it exists, and whose disappearance is only felt by the particular ease that rushes in to replace it once it is gone. We told our children, Thomas and Anna, together on a Sunday afternoon several weeks after Robert first told me, understanding that this was Robert's story to share with them on his own terms, but that sharing it felt important for the same reasons Robert had articulated to me. The desire to be fully known, finally, by the people most central to his life. Their reactions were their own, and I will protect those reactions by not describing them in detail here, because they belong to Thomas and Anna rather than to this story. I will only say that both of them, in their own way, responded with the fundamental love and intelligence that Robert had told me he trusted me to offer, and which, it turns out, they had both learned in their own different ways, from watching their parents navigate complexity with honesty and care across 30 years. We are 8 months out from that dinner now, from the evening Robert sat across from me with his coffee cup held in both hands, and told me something he should have told me a long time ago. Our marriage is still our marriage. That is perhaps the most important thing I can tell you. The 30 years we built together are not diminished by what I learned on that October evening. They are simply more fully understood. I know now that the man I married was a more complicated person than the version of himself he allowed me to see completely, and I know now that he chose, finally, to give me the fuller version. Not because he was forced to, not because a crisis or an accident required it, but because he loved me enough to want me to know all of him before we ran out of time together. That choice, made freely and with full understanding of its risks, is something I find myself returning to often when I think about what this past year has taught me about love and about marriage. That I think most of us, when we imagine what a long marriage is built on, imagine something like complete transparency. Two people who have gradually shared everything, who know each other without remainder, who have built their trust out of the particular accumulation of total mutual knowledge across decades of ordinary closeness. I believe now that this image is somewhat idealized. I believe that even in the most genuinely intimate marriages, there are usually pieces of history, pieces of private self-understanding, pieces of old complexity, that one or both partners have never quite found the courage or the occasion to fully share. Not because the marriage is dishonest, and not because the love is incomplete, but simply because full self-disclosure is one of the most genuinely difficult things any human being can offer to another, requiring both a kind of courage and a kind of trust that often takes years, sometimes decades, sometimes longer, to fully develop. That I do not believe Robert was wrong to love me across 30 years, while still carrying something private about himself that he had not found the courage to share. I believe he was human, in the specific and complicated way that all of us are human, doing our best to build something real with someone we love, while carrying, as all of us carry, the particular weight of the places where our own courage has not yet caught up with our intentions. What I believe was genuinely right, and genuinely brave, was his eventual decision to finally cross that gap. To choose at 66, with whatever time remained, to give me the fuller version of himself, finally and completely, at a cost that I know was real and significant to him, simply because he valued my full knowing of him over his own continued comfort in concealment. I want to offer you something. If you are sitting with your own version of this story, a piece of yourself, or a piece of your history, that you have been carrying silently alongside the person you love, convinced that the time was never quite right, that the sharing was never quite necessary, that the marriage was complete enough without it. You might be right about all of those things in one way or another. Marriages survive on partial disclosure all the time. People live whole, genuine, good lives side by side without ever sharing the deepest or most complicated aspects of themselves. But I want to tell you what I found on the other side of Robert's 30-year silence finally breaking, in case it is useful to you. I found a different quality of closeness. A specific, subtle ease in our daily life together that I had not known was missing until I suddenly had it. The ease that comes when the person beside you knows all of you, finally, without remainder. That I found a man I had been married to for 30 years and loved deeply all that time, who somehow, against all odds, had found a way to become a little more himself to me in his 60s than he had managed to be in his 30s or 40s or 50s. And I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that 30 years was not too late for that kind of deepening. It was in fact exactly the right time.